Okay, so we'll get started. Welcome to our audience around the world, as well as to you. So thank you for coming. This is a great treat for all of us to be here. I think this is my fourth time in Perugia at the International Journalism Festival, and it's one of those things that when I come, I always have to remind my colleagues that it really is work. I'm not just here to drink wine. So if you see me drinking wine, don't tell my colleagues back in the United States. We have a great panel today that's a little bit different than some of the things that we have done before. And just to give you a little bit of background, I'm going to start by talking about the growth of fact-checking. But first, I want to introduce our panel. I am Bill Adair. I am the Knight Professor for the Practice of Journalism and Public Policy at Duke University in the United States. It's in Durham, North Carolina. Joining me is Alexios Mantzarlis from Pagella Politica and FactCheck EU, and Peter Cunliffe-Jones from Africa Check, and Peter is based in London. We have done this before with various things, so we know each other well, and you'll see plenty of evidence of that because we have a lot of fun together and we want to keep this free-flowing. I thought we'd talk for 40, 45 minutes and then be happy to answer questions. This is the kind of thing we can talk about forever because all of the three of us believe so much in fact-checking, and it's also a lot of fun. I find it to be a really rewarding form of journalism. So I thought I would start by just talking about the growth of fact-checking around the world, just so you have a sense that this is a really important global movement in journalism. And it's relatively new, and it has sprung up for a variety of reasons, the biggest one being that we're all connected by the internet. And of course, the connection of the internet means that crazy political claims can spread much faster. And so what has happened is that journalists have sprung up to try to fact-check the political claims. They're not all crazy, but it is a time when when just a ridiculous falsehood can spread incredibly fast. So I'm going to show you some data from a fact-checking census that we did at Duke. This is a map. If you go to our website, which is reporterslab.org, which I have unfortunately neglected to type on here, but reporterslab.org, you can see our database of fact checkers, and it's interactive, so you can look at it as a map, you can look at it by country, and you can see all the fact checking that's going on around the world. And as you can see here, each check mark, of course, represents a dedicated fact-checking site. When we did our census in January, we found 89 fact-checking sites that have been active in the past 3 years. We look beyond just those that are currently active because we recognize that for some news organizations, fact-checking is a campaign thing, something that they do only during political campaigns and then they stop. So 89 active in the past 3 years. There are 64 that are currently active, and rapid growth. Just 30 new sites in the past year. Now part of that is we found sites that we didn't know about, that not all of those are newly started sites, but many are, particularly in Latin America, where Laura Zammer at Chicado and Carolina Cairo have been leading a wonderful movement in the growth of fact-checking in Latin America. And I'll show you how much growth there has been there. There are 38 fact-checking sites in Europe that have been active in the past few years. And the source for that is the Duke Reporters Lab, which is part of my work at Duke University. In the United States, I think the number is something like 28 now, something like that. not just dedicated fact-checking organizations like PolitiFact and factcheck.org, but also many news organizations, newspapers, but also television stations are dedicating people to do fact-checking. And here's a look at the 7 sites in South America. So just to talk a little bit about what they're like, 56 of the 89 sites are part of legacy news organizations, meaning they're part of newspapers, television stations, television networks. The other 33 are startup companies, not-for-profits, or NGOs, like Peter and Alexios's organizations. 80% of them use ratings. This is a fun topic that yielded one of the most spirited debates I've taken part in a long time. It began here last year, a debate between me and Will Moy, who runs FullFact, the fact-checking website in the UK, and I'm a big supporter of rating systems. I'm the inventor of the Truthometer at PolitiFact and our True to Pants on Fire scale. And Will does not believe in rating systems, and so we had a very spirited debate here last year. And I think, did we actually get down on the floor and wrestle? You know, was it was pretty civil though, right? But I'm a big believer in ratings, and the Truthometer there on your left, the Pinocchio from the Washington Post in the center, and then from Alexios's site, FactCheck EU, just a couple of the ratings that he uses, rather daft, and my favorite, insane whopper. So, and the whole idea is when you do journalism to research a political claim, that you provide the additional summary for a reader by telling them what the rating is. 29 of the 89 sites track campaign promises of presidents, prime ministers, governors, and mayors. You see the Morsi meter there on the left. That's from Egypt, site obviously not around since the coup. And then the Obameter, which is PolitiFact's feature that tracks President Obama's campaign promises. So it's important, though, to realize that the growth in fact-checking is not just in organizations like ours, that it is occurring in many, many newsrooms where a reporter who covers a beat, it might be a reporter who covers the state government, the local government, who covers a special beat like taxes or the economy, will realize that there is a claim that's being made and decide that he or she needs to fact-check that. And so this kind of fact-checking, you could almost call it sort of beat, we probably should give it a name, beat fact-checking or something, is definitely growing. I know that just anecdotally. I don't know that we have data on it. Lucas Graves, a professor at the University of Wisconsin, has gathered some data on this, but I don't think that he has looked at it over time. Many of them are labeled fact-check, and this is how we find them at PolitiFact. One of our writers aggregates all the fact-checking that's going on around the United States, and so he does a search every day for the phrase fact-check. And so you'll see them where it just may be a reporter who hears something and thinks, I need to fact-check that. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And we're here to tell you that fact-checking is not just for fact-checkers, that you can do it at your news organization. You don't need a big team. You don't need to dedicate a staff to it. You don't need to build a new website. All you need are the same tools that you use when you do any kind of news reporting. It's particularly good when you have beat reporters fact-checking claims on their beat, because they know the subject the best. They know when somebody says something and it's not accurate. So I just wanted to show a few examples. This was one I actually heard of last week from Peter. This was a remarkable segment on the BBC where there were reports coming out of Russia that a 10-year-old had been killed in Ukraine because of shelling. And this was part of the propaganda from Russia to try to suggest that because Ukraine was resisting and was engaged in this war, that innocent children were dying. And so the BBC reporter did a marvelous job at just going town to town, interviewing people around the town. Who knows the 10-year-old? And she couldn't find anyone and concluded that it was just, there was no truth to it. This was one done by the Wall Street Journal. Rand Paul, who is a United States senator who is running for president, he is an opponent of the Federal Reserve Bank, and he makes a lot of claims about the Fed, as we call it, and the Wall Street Journal checked many of them and found that generally they were not true. And this was a very good article written by a reporter who really knows the Fed, and so he was able to bring some real expertise to it. This was one by the Associated Press. The Associated Press does a lot of fact-checking, but it isn't branded in any single place. The Associated Press provides content, as I'm sure you all know, to news organizations around the world, and so and they do regular fact checks by their beat reporters. And then finally, this is one by a newspaper in Iowa. Iowa is one of the early states in our presidential primary. And you know, our presidential election campaign process just takes about 10 years from the time the candidates first start running until we finally have the election. And so this is one of the early fact checks. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to these guys, and we can talk a little bit. I think Peter's going to talk about Africa Check, and I'll put that up on the screen here. So Peter is not just a fact checker, but also an evangelist for fact checking, and so he's trying to spread the faith throughout Africa.
Sure. There's a long and unhappy history of evangelists going to Africa, so I probably won't pursue that too much. But I mean, to explain, I work for the AFP news agency, the AFP Foundation, which is the non-profit arm of AFP. And 3 years ago, we set up Africa Check, which isn't up there, but might be at some point.
Website up on, there we go.
It's looking very nice on there. There we go. And so it's based in the journalism department of Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa, and operates in South Africa, in Nigeria. We should very shortly be operating in French from Senegal, Dakar, Senegal, and does what quite a lot of the other fact-checking sites do, looking at claims that are made in the public space and looking at the evidence and so on. And they then have been picked up in the media. We give these out, we make them available and send them out to media houses. So they get carried very widely in all the main South African media. Our researchers then get called on radio and TV and so on. And so there's a very significant increase in the understanding of what fact-checking is since we've been starting doing this in the South African media. But sort of more than that, we wanted, as Bill was saying, we wanted to encourage, to evangelize, to encourage fact-checking and to enable fact-checking, because you can't have. It's incredibly dangerous in any media environment where you have one organization, you know, the state media providing the state story. You can't have one fact-checking organization doing fact-checking. You need hundreds, thousands of media checking claims at every level: local journalism, community journalism, national, regional. So we run an awards. We started it last year, and 40 different media houses from 10 different countries entered the awards. We'll be launching it again next month, and we hope that more will be taking part. It was won, you can see the picture there, by a great journalist from Ghana who had produced a film looking at claims made about by the Ghanaian government to have eradicated a practice that was of alluvial gold mining, so gold mining in rivers, which they use mercury in order to do the gold mining, and it's destroying Ghana's rivers. The government claimed to have eradicated it. They went and filmed people doing it. It was a reasonably simple process, but it was very, very well done. It was very powerful and so on. As a result of providing the awards, this film that had sort of sunk without trace, so to speak, in Ghana, was then given a national showing. It's now been picked up and being funded to be shown in all the schools, or in schools in every district, not in every school, but in schools in every district of Ghana, where they're then having discussions at school level about the harm being done to the rivers by this practice that the government said had been eradicated. So there's a real impact through the awards, and that's what we're trying to do, is to support and encourage that. But part of that is that we recognize that it's, without being self-congratulatory, that fact-checking is quite difficult. And so we try to provide resources on the site, and that's something I think we can maybe talk about what enables people to do fact-checking. And the biggest thing that we found that operating in South Africa and in Nigeria in particular is that it's very hard to get hold of the data, of reliable data, to check the claims that are being made against. So that's something that we're trying to do through the site, is to make that available to people in ways that we're all journalists, and ways that work for journalists. But so that's one of the first things we do. But the fundamental thing that I think we're doing is to try to kickstart the skeptical reflex, so that people don't, as reporters too often do, go on autopilot, and just somebody, a minister, an official, a company owner has said something, so you report it. And there's a lot of that takes place. And so I think it's by providing the example of fact-checking, that's one of the things that we're, and then providing the tools to carry it out, we're trying to kickstart that reflex, and then provide the tools to deal with it in the regular journalistic workplace.
Great.
I'll stop there.
Alexios?
Hi. Hi, everyone. So, as we're talking about why journalists should actually care about fact-checking, it's worth starting with the awkward truth that journalists reporters and fact-checkers often play on opposing teams in the battle between accuracy and timeliness. We root for different sides, and this is important to understand why there are two worlds that try to do the same thing, carry information, but often don't speak to each other, and we want them to do that more. So, this is true to the extent that we have had a leading editor of an Italian newspaper tell us, "Oh, you're the facts guys." Who cares? So that was nice. But just as reporters need more facts, so fact checkers need to be more relevant to the news that are going on right now. It's no point if you prepare a beautiful fact check that is 3 days late on the news cycle. It's not going to be useful for the people who are discussing the news at that time. But what I wanted to cover is that actually beat reporters should care about fact-checking, because fact-checking can actually be newsworthy. We started out as 10 idiots out of uni, and we were approached as our fact-checking site in Italy got larger, by media organizations who wanted fact-check content on TV, on radio, on press, online. suddenly we were like, okay, so this isn't just a civic duty, there's actually novelty and newsworthiness to it. And why is that? I mean, I found 3 reasons. One, I mean, fact-checking can be funny. So when someone says, you know, the EU wants to ban toasters, and it's, you know, lunacy, it makes for a funny fluff piece that you can run and people will read something pleasant that isn't just kitten, but actually it talks about something concrete, like the EU and what it does. It speaks truth to power. So when we bring fact checks that force politicians, and this has happened only via our interaction with reporters, because it is rare that a politician will apologize or correct his claim just from what happens on our site. But when that fact check is carried on TV or on radio, they correct themselves. And that's, once again, great news. To have a politician fumble an excuse as to why they made up a number, that's newsworthy. And finally, it's, you know, part of reporters' job should be to inform, not to bring information. And I will forever remember this piece on The Guardian on how much difference there is on basic indicators, the knowledge of people and what the numbers actually are. You should look it up. There's this huge discrepancy. I think they did it just in, not just in Britain, actually, across Europe. If you ask average people, what's unemployment rate? What's the rate of how many Muslims are there in the country? How many foreigners are in this country? You know, very basic indicators. And people just don't know. So actually, fact-checking, bringing facts to the table is not just being, you know, boring and a guy who just can't have a laugh. You're bringing information that is needed. So what can we do? How can we team up is what I would like to see if anyone has ideas and to get out of these few days. So no one thinks reporting can live without a more concrete and coherent process of fact-checking, and I think I see Craig Silverman here. If you read, you know, if you see how much damage not fact-checking has done to the credibility of the press. So clearly it's something that is necessary. We have sent out a survey to journalists in Italy about a service we are preparing, which is called Trovadato, which supports people, journalists, to find reliable data, basically. And the 3, I had them somewhere, but the 3 things that the interviewed journalists rated highest among the things they need is that they can't, when they're looking for data, that is, they're not sure about the reliability of the source, they're not sure if it's the most up-to-date, and they're not happy in the format it's delivered. This is maybe more the case in Italy than elsewhere, but when you finally find data, sometimes it's, you know, in a PDF at best. I mean, sometimes we found it in a JPEG, and it's just like, why have you put a table on a JPEG? What possessed you? But it happens, and what we do, which wastes a lot of time, is translate this data into something that we then reuse, and in 2.5 years of work, we have collected and put together an archive of 10,000 data sets. This is something that we believe is sort of the scrap of our work, because we hyperlink to these sources, or we transform them into Google Excels, for example. But it's material and content that journalists could go to, could use to know that it's a more, you know, certified than just looking it up on Google. So it's a two-way street. We, as purely fact-checking organizations, need reporters. I mean, sometimes we come out with fact checks, at least on Pagella and on Fact Check EU, and we're so excited because we think it's, you know, really newsworthy, and then traffic just tanks because no one cares. And I think that's part of, I don't want to make it everyone's thing, but part of fact-checking is also that we don't quite have that tactile feel for what's going on in the constant news cycle, but we do bring an attention to data that everyone uses, that all reporters use, because we're not fact-checking, you know, what my mother said. We're fact-checking official leaders. So chances are it's data and information that reporters will fall on time after time and will not know whether it's true or not. That's a very inconclusive end to my speech.
So you mentioned the resistance in a newsroom. What advice do we have for reporters, editors who run into that? I mean, I ran into it at the St. Petersburg Times initially, where the political editor wanted nothing to do with it. And he said those words. He was like, I love it, it's a great idea, let's do it. I want nothing to do with it. Because in his view back then, it was disruptive, and I think he was concerned that it was going to mess up the balance he had of sources, and that if people got mad at the fact checkers, they would take it out on him. How should we overcome that?
To me, it goes to the question of what's the point of having reporters if you know that they're reporting nonsense. You know, I mean, if you have two politicians who are in an election campaign, both of whom are talking crap, and you simply repeat what they're saying, that's, you know, you're not. That, to me, that's at best that's half the job you're supposed to be doing. So I don't really see the point of doing journalism if you're not trying to tell the reader what you think has actually happened. I mean, I was just talking earlier to somebody who works with us in Nigeria who's here today, and he was talking about the new person in charge of the main statistics agency in Nigeria, who's a real reformist and who's taken a very moribund organization and has revised it over the last 2 or 3 years. And it's really starting from a very low base. It's come on a long way. And Tolu, my colleague, was saying that he'd gone and interviewed him for a newspaper, and the man had said, listen, I'll talk to you quite a lot off the record, and I'll give you names so that you know if I disappear, this is why. Because he said, you know, I come out with poverty statistics. Nigeria has 36 states. He said, I come out with poverty statistics for all the states. And immediately I do that, I get the governors phoning up and saying, you can't put that out. It might be true, but you can't put that out. You know, I'm telling people that in fact poverty is improving and this way. Well, I think if he can stand up to, there's only one of him, you know, and the point is that there is a growing movement of fact-checking organizations that are doing this. It's being picked up, and there's Tolu. I was just telling this story about the challenge of statistics in Nigeria. But there's a growing number of organizations like ourselves. We put out these reports. They're widely picked up in the media, so they're running that sort of content. And I think that in the end, if newspapers are knowingly putting out bullshit in the paper, then, you know, or the radio or whatever it is, it totally devalues what they're doing. But there's safety in numbers. You know, that the more who do it, the more accepted it becomes as a part of what journalism has to be about. Then the better it is.
So if you encounter that kind of resistance from somebody. And I should say about the political editor at my paper, he pretty quickly after we launched realized it was complementary to his work and became a great promoter for us and also a great source of things that we would fact check. So he would hear something, he still does this, and he will tweet, you know, here's the quote, PolitiFact, ? But when you get, what about at the editing level? When you deal with news organizations in Africa, do you get editors who are like, that sounds like that's going to make a lot of people angry, I don't want to get into it?
They don't tend to tell us that. I mean, so people don't know. They may or may not use what we put out. I mean, they're free to do that. But not really. I mean, the reaction really has been hugely positive. If I go through our Twitter followers, for example, it's the vast, or a disproportionately high number are journalists. Journalists love this because it's what journalism is supposed to be about. Most people don't go into journalism saying, I think I'll go in order to tell half the truth about the world I see. You might go in for lots of misguided reasons, the money, the fame, and all of it, or you go in, most people, if they go in, it's because they want to describe their world as they see it. And so I think there's a basic instinct that a lot of people have, but that journalists certainly have, that you want to tell the truth. So we've so far had, and we operate, I should say, for all the flaws. I mean, we operate primarily in South Africa, in Nigeria. They have many flaws to the information systems in those countries, but they are relatively free. If we were operating in Eritrea, for example, in Ethiopia, in Rwanda, perhaps, that there are some climates that would be much harder, and I think sensible people would be more cautious about that and so on. But where you don't have those sorts of threats, what we're doing, journalists love it, readers love it. The reaction is really positive, and I think, like the editor you were talking about, they catch on and they see that. And if they don't tell us.
Alexios, can anybody fact check? Can any reporter jump in and do this? What's your sense of how much training, manuals, how hard is it for a beat reporter to jump in and do it?
So I come to this question from the Fact Check EU perspective, actually. On the European side, which is a spin-off of Pagella Politica, we have tried to crowd source part of our work. So users help us fact check. Nothing that the crowd writes goes entirely unpeer-reviewed onto the website, but they do help us find the data. I think people can find the data actually a lot of the time. I think it depends from country to country, and actually even Italy is a pretty terrible country to find the data, but elsewhere in Europe, I mean, I love the UK statistical bodies, but what's maybe trickier is the process of justifying, if you have a verdict, of why you are going one side or the other. Because finding relevant data, and everyone can try that. If I can, on the previous question, I'm afraid it is an issue in the sense that in TV, which we've now had second year running a collaboration with a big TV show, there are times when, a lot of times when we're told, but I don't know if do we really want to tell that guy that was a total lie? Will he come again? These talk shows are based on, getting big names there. If you get the big name there and he brings the audience, the share to your TV show, it's not courtesy, is it, to tell him, you're a big fat liar. But the flip side is that, one, it's good TV, too. So actually that kind of attenuates. And what has helped with us, in a way, is that if you isolate the fact-checking, make it into a bit of a skit, nearly. I don't want to say that, I mean, we use some humor, as much humor as you can use with, GDP growth, but you try to make it into a bit of a routine, kind of, in which they can't really get angry with the person. It's just something you go through. That
you guys bring more humor to the discussion of GDP growth, I think, than anyone I've ever known.
I'll take that.
So we should explain how unique these segments are that you do. So most of the TV segments in the United States, in fact, pretty much all of them that I've ever seen or taken part in, are a reporter goes on camera and is asked, often they'll play a little video of the statement, and then the reporter, then they come back to the reporter and they'll say, so you found that false, can you explain why? And it's a pretty short segment. Your segment, explain a little bit about how this works, that you have, so it is in an in-depth discussion of a single fact check. You usually bring in the person who made the claim, and there's a lot of back and forth. It's like grilling the fact checker.
So yeah, let me premise that it's a lot of hard work. Working, especially with public TV, I was very impressed that it would have been Rai that was ready to do something as, in a way, dangerous as fact-checking. This has been a slug, for people who come entirely from a website to be able to mediate into a TV product. But yeah, when we work, it's not, there are two aspects. First, the newsworthiness or the keeping your audience comes from leaving the verdict last. So the audience follows you through the boring stuff, which is where you actually explain why something is true or false, because they want to know the verdict. So that's always helped. And the other thing that helps is that there is back and forth with the person involved. That's the hardest part, because usually they're trained to dispel something that's been told about them, and as a fact checker, you are not. But if you're standing after that, that's far more effective. I mean, when you're in Italy, everyone, I mean, if there's Italians in here, I'm sure your mother, your brother, your father, someone in your family, close family, believes that prices doubled with the euro. I'm certain. My mother does. Don't feel embarrassed. And so when you go through something like this in front of 1 million people, it's a lot more. And 1 million people who are more likely to believe that than when you do it in front of tens of thousands of your readers online, you're doing a much bigger service. So again, the need for a symbiotic relationship between fact checkers and reporters for me is key.
So what tips do we have for editors, producers, reporters who are interested in doing fact-checking as part of their other work? What should they do? What should they look for? Let's give them 3 or 4 tips.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing, I mean, the first question so we have a protocol that whenever we look at a claim that's been made, the first protocol is that we contact the person or the office that released the claim, and we ask what the evidence is. And the first simplest thing, if you're doing a live Q&A on radio or TV or whatever you're doing, is the minister who provided no evidence for the claim said such and such. That's fact-checking. If you're working for 24-hour radio, you can't necessarily spend all the time that fact-checking organizations do looking into the statistics, but you know that the minister's made a big claim, and if if they don't provide you with any evidence, or if they didn't in their speech or in their statement provide you with any evidence, you can say that, and that's the most basic, the most important, fundamental thing that time and again you don't see appearing in the papers, on the radio, or whatever.
I agree, and I love that idea, and I think we should start a campaign to, that should be a basic, one of the who, what, where, when, how did you get the data? What's your source? So I think, and I agree with you completely. How many stories have you read where a reporter will let somebody get away completely with making some claim and provide nothing to back it up, Alexios, what tips do you have?
I mean, one thing that I always surprised is how helpful people who crunch the data are. Like, if you reach out to someone at the statistical office or at Frontex, or find the person who actually manages those data sets, they are always very, very happy actually to help you, to walk you through that, how that data is to be presented. Because imagine these poor people, they live most of their time pushing out data that is misrepresented. I know this for a fact because in Italy, the Italian Statistical Office has had to change the way it publishes youth unemployment figures, because they would say the youth unemployment rate is 40%. The titles would all be 4 out of 10 young people in Italy are unemployed. That's not true. Those are two different things. Youth unemployment rate excludes students. In the age bracket 15 to 24, that's a lot of people. So you can't say 4 out of 10 people are unemployed. And this is, something that statisticians, they're just hungering to present to have their data presented correctly.
Now, in the U.S., we often find statisticians don't want to be quoted. Do you guys find that too in your countries? I mean, they'll help you, but they don't want to be mentioned in the article.
Yeah, I mean, so Africa Check is based, very deliberately in South Africa, is based in the department of a university, and so a lot of the time we're quoting academics who love being quoted, and by the way, the paper I wrote about this can be found on this link, and my book on Amazon is. So yes, it may be the statistician who walks you through it, but then you'll get an explanation of it from an academic, or it's not. And they are very useful because they can put it in context and so on. But in fact, going to the point about the Alexios was making, I think that beyond the fundamental thing that if somebody says something, ask them for the evidence, which shouldn't be rocket science, is actually, look, most people who go into the media, whether it's from a print perspective or radio or what have you, do not do so with maths degrees. They haven't done statistics courses, and you don't need to. None of the people who work for Africa Check are statisticians, but they're learning some of those simple traps, and I think there are a lot of quite simple traps that you can pick up on. I love the title of it, the full fact that we just mentioned before. They now run something they call a stats self-defense course for journalists in London, where they're trying to train journalists in how not to be fooled by statistics. And it goes through things like, look at the time frame the minister will show you a carefully selected graph that shows an uptick in something positive or a downtick in something negative, and it's very careful, and then you find actually, it crashed like that, and it's just gone up here over this time frame, and so on. So you draw it out. So look at the time frame. Ask what's the actual sample size. So it's 4 out of 10. When all of these people are taken out of the network, therefore it's not actually 4 out of 10 of the entire population. All those sorts of things which a year doing fact-checking teaches you to look for immediately. But I don't think they are a natural reflex of journalists. And so that's the first thing. And we try to provide through our sort of how to fact-check section of our site is some understanding of basic how to defend yourself in the sort of blizzard of statistics from a crafty politician.
So we got about 10 minutes left. Be happy to take questions or comments from anybody.
Or go for a glass of wine.
Yeah, or we'll just go for a glass of wine. Mm-hmm. Any questions? All right. Craig
Hello.
Silverman.
So I was wondering, one of the challenges is reaching people who, in a sense, don't want to be reached, who believe the information that's being put out there because it's in their interest or it aligns with pre-existing beliefs. I'm wondering, just if you think what some of the approaches are for kind of getting past that inherent bias that people might have to, because sometimes I feel like the people who most need the fact-checking will ignore the fact-checking. And I wonder if you have any thoughts of sort of ways of cutting through or ways of actually making your stuff travel into those communities where maybe there's already, the misinformation has taken hold.
Sure. One of you guys want to take that?
So if I take an example that Africa Check worked with, we work a lot around claims that are made around issues of crime and race in South Africa. And you've got some very entrenched views in different communities and people with different perspectives and in the country. And so the first thing is that if you look at how people react to our reports when we report about that, a lot of people will react. We put out a tweet or we put out a report and it'll have a headline that presents our conclusion. And we do that in part because we don't expect most people to work through, as you were saying, to work through all of the evidence. And so we say, right, so the first thing is we tell you the conclusion, and then we say, right, what was the premise that we looked at that on? And then we walk you through it, and then we explain, right, so this is the more in-depth conclusion. In a lot of ways, I think that's, it works for one audience and it doesn't work for the other, because showing you working out is the most important thing you can do. And so, so in radio terms or TV terms, the thing that Alexios does, I think is great, because it takes somebody through and says, right, so we start from the premise of 4 out of 10 young people are unemployed. It looks realistic because they say 40% and so on. So, and you start with that. Oh, but hold on, this. And then oh, but hold on, what about that? And then you go through a series of steps and you can, right, so that's your conclusion. And if you get a chance to do that, and to me, the best chance is to try to think through or to be able to use a variety of different formats to get material out. So we work very hard to get on radio, to get on TV, as well as putting stuff out that'll go on websites and so on. But it is the way to do it, I think, is to present it as much as possible in a way that enables you to show you're working out before you reveal the conclusion.
Yeah, this is obviously something that we sometimes stay up at night on, in the sense that we've seen research that says the closer a belief is to you personally, the less you'll believe anything that contradicts that. And again, the fact that I can't, for the life of me, convince my mother that prices with the euro have not doubled is anecdotal evidence of this. But perhaps I will have an answer in 6 months' time, when we're partnering up with a poli-sci professor at the University of Dartmouth to see whether different ways that you structure, you present your fact checks, whether there are certain cues that you should or shouldn't use. So, I don't know how familiar you are with Italian politics, but I'm sure everyone knows Berlusconi. So if you're a Berlusconi fan, will it help or hinder your clicking through to the fact check if you see that it's Berlusconi and it's a big pants on fire under? Will it help or hinder if there's already some kind of explanation but not the actual verdict? Are you inherently going to the fact checks that confirm your own partisan beliefs? So I don't know. I suspect that there is some self-selecting. I hope and trust that there are ways that you can structure the way you present it to work against that.
I think there are. There's already. I think there are quite a lot of studies being done into how you. So there was a study that was sent around amongst fact-checking organizations a few weeks ago, saying essentially, if you present the information that is right as your headline, as your lead point, as your lead, rather than, I mean, what we tend to do is to say, ha ha, this person has got it wrong on that. And people love that, particularly if they agree, if they don't like that person, if they want it. So that draws in a lot of audience, and we say, right, we've got audience, then we're doing our job. But actually, if your thing is, it's only 2.5 people out of 10 are, 2.5 young people out of 10, or 2 people out of, how do you have a half person? 2 people out of 10 are young people are unemployed in Italy, then they will come away with a greater understanding of the truth than if you say this minister was wrong to say, this official was wrong to say it's 4 out of 10. If it's, because you say that, people come away with the wrong impression. But I think there's quite a lot of work being done to look into how you maximize the understanding of the truth.
I think that is so important. I was talking to the PolitiFact editor about this yesterday. Sometimes I think as fact checkers we have a tendency only to write about the falsehoods, and then I think we distort people's view of the discourse because they think, those liars, they lie all the time. Well, they get a lot of stuff right, you know. And so one thing we did from the start with PolitiFact was, if we were curious about it, if it was a claim where a reasonable person would hear it and wonder, is that true? Then we would fact check it. And if we got to a conclusion that it's true, we still published the fact check. I think that's really important. And that's something where there is some disagreement among fact checkers. Factcheck.org, the pioneer of fact checking and an organization for which I have tremendous respect, their process usually is, if they find a claim is true, they don't usually publish about it. And so, you know, there's room to disagree. I just think there's value, and I think of it from the point of the curiosity of the reader. If the reader's wondering if something's true, we should answer, even if it is true. You have a question in front.
Actually, I got 2 questions.
Okay.
The first one is, how can a fact-checking organization be sure or reassure the users that it is neutral and balanced and not biased? And the second question is, how can fact-checking be effective in an environment where there's no accountability or very little accountability? I'm thinking about the place we are. For example, Italy.
Your first question, are you referring to the fact-checking organization being neutral?
Yes. How can it defend itself from the accusation of being biased by the persons who are regularly pointed as liars?
Well, it's funny because we hear it all the time from both sides. I'm sure you guys do. And one easy answer is, hey, didn't you just use our fact check that attacked your opponent in your TV ad? You know, and so to remind them that the truth-o-meter swings both ways. Although that gets you into charges of false bias or false balance, where people will say, well, you're putting your thumb on the scale to give Democrats a false because you gave Republicans a false. We don't do that, but people complain about that anyway. I don't know, what do you guys think?
I mean, I think that the number one defense is, it's not about us, it's about the evidence. If we don't ask, in fact, I'd encourage people not to trust us. The idea is that we're trying to make people skeptical, not cynical, but skeptical, and to check the evidence. We can't, I mean, Africa is quite a big place, and we can't possibly check all the claims in one city, let alone one country, let alone 54. So we're not going to try and do that. What we're trying to do is to kickstart that reflex, and we ask them to deploy that towards us. And that's why with every report that we put out, with every element that is subject to dispute, we source it to evidence. There's a lot of things that we think that, look, it looks like this might be verified on that basis or disproven on that basis, but if we can't find the evidence, we don't say what our hunch is. We always base on evidence. I think that the only real defense of the charge of bias is a proper study of your work, and is your evidence, are your conclusions based on what statisticians will tell you are sound evidence?
So regarding neutrality, we started off at Pagella Politica with, we were young, I'm sorry, we believed things, that we would be able to cover every fact-based statement of the select group of politicians that we were following. 2 years in, we have a backlog that is larger than the amount of fact checks we published. So that, unfortunately, is not the solution. I think it's a mixture of what Bill and Peter said. You need, I mean, time helps. We launched close to the 2013 elections. We got insulted by supporters of Grillo, by supporters of Berlusconi, by supporters of Bersani. By the time we'd gone full circle and were slaves to every possible lobby in the country, that started going away. We also really, really push the idea that, hey, reader, don't trust us. We are going to put hyperlinks to every source that we mention, and I am shocked that journalists in other publications still don't do it in 2015. And we have a corrections page, so that we are now going to anchor to our homepage. So, you know, we've been wrong. We invite you to correct us. We will do our best to do that. It's particularly embarrassing when you're a fact checker, and that's the thing you do, and you need to correct yourself. But that's one thing. Regarding the accountability, just one thing, if you have time. Because it's about Italy, in a context where there is no accountability mechanisms, then you're the mechanism, or you're a tiny cog in the mechanism that will come. So it's frustrating because readers tell you, I don't care if he lies. Leading daily editors tell you, no one cares about the facts. So it's, again, it's a slug, but yeah, we do that too.
I agree, and I think I'm very encouraged about the anecdotes we hear about that show that we're holding them accountable and that they are responding. Things like a city official from Atlanta came up to me at a dinner and said, hey, I got a story to tell you. The mayor of Atlanta called us all into his office and said, I never want to get a rating from PolitiFact that is lower than mostly true. Don't, check everything you do. Don't let me make mistakes, And so they care, and some of them care. And they pay attention. I think as fact-checking gets better known, as Peter has seen in Africa, just the growth of Africa Check in 2 years, people know what Africa Check is now, and they're aware if they get called out. So I'm encouraged on that front. We need to wrap up, but we'd be happy to talk to anybody afterward, and we're going to be around for all of us. Peter's got to go back, but Alexios and I will be around for the next 2 days, so be happy to talk to you further. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Microphones in the after period, with like the mic's still on and people and yeah. Exactly. It's funny, I saw Margot at the, well, Craig was there. This is a fun topic that yielded one of the most spirited debates I've taken part in a long time. It began here last year, a debate between me and Will Moy, who runs Full Fact, the fact-checking website in the UK, and I'm a big supporter of rating systems. I'm the inventor of the Truthometer at PolitiFact, and our true to pants on fire scale. And Will does not believe in rating systems. And so we had a very spirited debate here last year. And I think, did we actually get down on the floor and wrestle? You know, was it, it was pretty civil though, right? But I'm a big believer in ratings, and the Truthometer there on your left, the Pinocchio from the Washington Post in the center, and then from Alexios's site, Fact Check EU, just a couple of the ratings that he uses, rather daft, and my favorite, insane whopper. So, and the whole idea is when you do journalism to research a political claim, that you provide the additional summary for a reader by telling them what the rating is. 29 of the 89 sites track campaign promises of presidents, prime ministers, governors, and mayors. You see the Morsi meter there on the left. That's from Egypt, site obviously not around since the coup. And then the Obameter, which is PolitiFact's feature that tracks President Obama's campaign promises. So it's important, though, to realize that the growth in fact check 3 years, there are 64 that are currently active, and rapid growth, just 30 new sites in the past year. Now, part of that is we found sites that we didn't know about, that not all of those are newly started sites, but many are, particularly in Latin America, where Lara Zammer at Chicado and Carolina Cairo have been leading a wonderful movement in the growth of fact-checking in Latin America. And I'll show you how much growth there has been there. There are 38 fact-checking sites in Europe that have been active in the past few years. And the source for that is the Duke Reporters Lab, which is part of my work at Duke University. In the United States, I think the number is something like 28 now, something like that. Not just dedicated fact-checking organizations like PolitiFact and factcheck.org, but also many news organizations, newspapers, but also television stations are dedicating people to do fact-checking. And here's a look at the 7 sites in South America. So just to talk a little bit about what they're like, 56 of the 89 sites are part of legacy news organizations, meaning they're part of newspapers, television stations, television networks. The other 33 are startup companies, not-for-profits or NGOs, like Peter and Alexios's organizations. 80% of them use ratings. Is not just in organizations like ours, that it is occurring in many, many newsrooms where a reporter who covers a beat, it might be a reporter who covers the state government, the local government, who covers a special beat like taxes or the economy, will realize that there is a claim that's being made and decide that he or she needs to fact check that. And so this kind of fact checking, you could almost call it sort of beat, we probably should give it a name, beat fact checking or something, is definitely growing. I know that just anecdotally. I don't know that we have data on it. Lucas Graves, a professor at the University of Wisconsin, has gathered some data on this, but I don't think that he has looked at it over time. Many of them are labeled fact check, and this is how we find them at PolitiFact. One of our writers aggregates all the fact checking that's going on around the United States, and so he does a search every day for the phrase fact check. And so you'll see them where it just may be a reporter who hears something and thinks, I need to fact check that. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And we're here to tell you that fact checking is not just for fact checkers, that you can do it at your news organization. You don't need a big team. You don't need to dedicate a staff to it. You don't need to build a new website. All you need are the same tools that you use when you do any kind of news reporting. It's particularly good when you have beat reporters fact-checking claims on their beat because they know the subject the best. The growth of fact-checking around the world, just so you have a sense that this is a really important global movement in journalism. And it's relatively new, and it has sprung up for a variety of reasons, the biggest one being that we're all connected by the internet. And of course, the connection of the internet means that crazy political claims can spread much faster. And so what has happened is that journalists have sprung up to try to fact check the political claims. They're not all crazy, but it is a time when when just a ridiculous falsehood can spread incredibly fast. So I'm going to show you some data from a fact-checking census that we did at Duke. This is a map. If you go to our website, which is reporterslab.org, which I have unfortunately neglected to type on here, but reporterslab.org, you can see our database of fact checkers, and it's interactive, so you can look at it as a map, you can look at it by country, and you can see all the fact checking that's going on around the world. And as you can see here, each check mark, of course, represents a dedicated fact checking site. When we did our census in January, we found 89 fact-checking sites that have been active in the past 3 years. We look beyond just those that are currently active because we recognize that for some news organizations, fact-checking is a campaign thing, something that they do only during political campaigns and then they stop. So 89 active in the past. Okay, so we'll get started. Welcome to our audience around the world, as well as to you. So thank you for coming. This is a great treat for all of us to be here. I think this is my 4th time in Perugia at the International Journalism Festival, and It's one of those things that when I come, I always have to remind my colleagues that it really is work. I'm not just here to drink wine. So if you see me drinking wine, don't tell my colleagues back in the United States. We have a great panel today that's a little bit different than some of the things that we have done before. And just to give you a little bit of background, I'm going to start by talking about the growth of fact-checking. But first, I want to introduce our panel. I am Bill Adair. I am the Knight Professor for the Practice of Journalism and Public Policy at Duke University in the United States. It's in Durham, North Carolina. Joining me is Alexios Mantzarlis from Pagella Politica and FactCheck EU, and Peter Cunliffe-Jones from Africa Check, and Peter is based in London. We have done this before with various things, so we know each other well, and you'll see plenty of evidence of that because we have a lot of fun together, and we want to keep this free-flowing. I thought we'd talk for 40, 45 minutes and then be happy to answer questions. This is the kind of thing we can talk about forever because all of the three of us believe so much in fact-checking, and it's also a lot of fun. I find it to be a really rewarding form of journalism. So I thought I would start by just talking about